Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth academic tradecraft workshop of the year. I'm Mark Goodale, Leverhulme Trust visiting professor at the University of Oxford. And first of all, happy March. I'm wearing something called a Marzieshor. And if anybody knows what that is, you can put your answer down into the comments. So as you know, we've been talking about a number of different themes and topics over the course of this workshop series. Some of them having to do with writing, some of them having to do with your career, more personal issues. And today I want to talk about a theme that is somewhere between both the personal and the academic. And the title of the workshop for today is to self-curate or not to self-curate. That is the question. And I am referring, of course, to platforms of social media, but I'm not using social media in the title of the workshop, but I'm using self-curation. And something like my use of academic simultaneity, the intentional use of self-curation also has an argument behind it. And here's the argument, and then I'll start the workshop. So basically, the argument is that as I see these different tools that academics use and that we might use, they give you the opportunity to control, to an extent that's not usually possible elsewhere, how you would like to be presented, how you would like to position yourself intellectually, ethically, and politically. And this is something that's very different than other kinds of academic genres, academic outlets, writing, publications, and so on. So these platforms of what I'm calling self-curation seem to have a qualitatively different potential than the other areas we might be working with. And there's something else about these different platforms of self-curation, and that is that the temporality is very different. So again, thinking about the temporality of publications or typical media that you might be working with as an academic, grant applications, articles, books, theses, and so on. As we've talked about before, the temporality can be very long, can be extended by months and indeed years. So the way in which you position yourself intellectually, let's say, or ethically or politically in an article has a certain solidity, a certain temporality that's not the same as these other platforms that I think come within the area of self-curation. And as you can already imagine, that more rapid, more immediate temporality has potential, but also it has risks. So what I want to do in this workshop is reflect on the disadvantages and advantages of these different platforms of self-curation. And I'm going to do so in a way that also refers to the other workshops, particularly the workshop on academic simultaneity, because as you'll see, in mobilizing and working with these different self-curation platforms, you are adding another activity to your plan, to your calendar, something you have to work at, and you might also add that to your overview that I talked about is working on the activities that you want to advance during a certain period of time. Now, before I talk about these platforms, as I always do, I have to begin also add an element of reflexivity, and that is that my understanding of these platforms, my thoughts about these different self-curation platforms reflects my own subject position. My age, my generation, my gender, my political orientation, all of the different things that make me, as you have your own orientation, who I am, also shape how I think about these different platforms. But as with these other workshops, I hope that given my own position, that what I'll have to say might be of use. So there are a lot of different platforms, a lot of different media that come within this genre of self-curation. I can't even pretend to be an expert in even the ones that I myself use, and I won't be able to talk about all of them, but I want to focus on three different kinds of platforms or different categories of self-curation. And I choose these for two reasons. One, because I think that they represent three quite distinct kinds of self-curation platforms. And then secondly, they just happen to be the ones that I myself work with. So I'll be able to draw on my own experience. So in doing this inclusion, let's say, I'm also excluding much more, which are also very relevant and also used by academics as platforms of self-curation, as I've described it. For example, Facebook, Instagram. I'm not sure if academics are using TikTok. I assume academics do. There's Blue Sky, which is supposedly replacing or not Twitter, now known as X. A lot of academics are increasingly using LinkedIn, which originally started as a business platform, but a lot of academics have LinkedIn pages. There's also Google Scholar, which I'm not going to talk about either. Wikipedia. Academics have Wikipedia pages, and I do have a lot to say about the possibility or the difficulty, the risk of let's say, allowing your entry to be created. Again, I wonder, it would be an interesting question, how many academics play a role in the creation of their own Wikipedia entries to the extent to which they have them. Leaving that aside, I'm not going to talk about Wikipedia either. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about three. I'm going to talk about websites, meaning the professional websites. I'm going to talk about, which is different than the departmental entry, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I'm going to talk about research sharing platforms like academia.edu and particularly ResearchGate. And finally, I'm going to say a few things about Twitter or X. So let me start with a website as a potential platform of self-curation, a potential tool of self-curation. And I want to distinguish the professional website from, say, a departmental entry. So you click on a department, the department of X discipline, you'll have faculty members, staff members, as they call them here in Britain. You might have a section for postgraduate students and so on. And I'm not referring to these kind of entries. And it's not to say that you shouldn't use those entries or allow an entry to be created on your behalf. But the difference is that if you think about the departmental website or the departmental biography or entry for you, potentially, these are platforms which are very carefully controlled and standardized by the institution, by the department, by the university. They're often very tight regulations, very strict regulations about both the form and the content. So the form has to be standardized, so you don't have the room to add photos often or change the look of the entry. And of course, content. You're often given a template, and you follow the template and add your own information. And there's a reason that departments and universities do that. They're trying to manage risk. They're trying to avoid perhaps problems. And maybe there's also an issue of equity. They want to have a common look so that people can't precisely use their departmental entry as a vehicle for self-curation. And in a way, the collective entries of all the staff and P and DPhil is more the self-curation of the department or the university rather than the individuals, okay? Now, having said that, as I mentioned before, I think that you should have a departmental entry. I have my departmental or college entries here at Oxford and back in Lausanne. That's fine. But the point here about self-curation is that you have as much control as possible in deciding how you are positioned intellectually, ethically, and politically in the field or beyond, and that comes with your own professional website. Now, I have had my own. I start with this because it's the oldest platform, the platform I've used the longest. I've had my own professional website since 2011. I finished my PhD in 2001, which means I waited about a decade after I finished my PhD to launch a website. I don't think you need to wait until you've been in the field or you've have a career for a decade before starting a website. In fact, I think PhD students and junior scholars should definitely think about putting in the time and the investment to launch a website, which you can then build on as your career evolves, as your career develops, and gives you this stable, regular place in which you can position yourself, in which you can intervene, in which you can do various things, and which you yourself are able to control. And I guess what I would say about the website, the professional website, is that I look at it as something like a visual dynamic curriculum vitae. So, if you think about a CV, you have it in a Word document, you post it various places, but it has, speaking of the temporality of self-curation, it has a solidity that is not supposed to change. And you add, maybe every once in a while you give a talk or something happens, but in a way, the basic structure of the record of your life, let's say, there's a certain structure that remains the same. Your education, and of course, each time you add something to your CV, you're not changing what has gone before. So you're adding something, and in fact, as your career goes on, now that I think about it sort of spontaneously, that foundation of the record of your life becomes even more solid as you go on. And at some point, you're not adding, let's say, imagine at the end of a career, you're not adding anything at some point, and then you have your record of your academic life that's there, not for all time, but it's there. So a website is obviously more dynamic than that. It shares some of that solidity, that temporality of a normal CV, but you can do much more. You can put photos. You can embed other platforms like Twitter and Instagram or these other platforms. You can embed them into your WordPress or whatever the tool you use. Now, I should say that again, reflecting about myself, eventually I had to pay a professional designer to design the website or to change it, because I had a website that was very rudimentary for the first, say, 5 to 6 years, and then I had a designer. So there's an expense there, but I think it is definitely worth it. And if I think about my website compared to others that I look at from time to time, it's still not very sophisticated. So I've always seen different, mostly design aspects that people incorporate into the websites that I'm very jealous of and admire, but I'm not going to go back and try to redesign the website every time I come across something that looks really cool. So pros and cons of websites, the professional website, again, not the departmental entry, but something that you yourself control. So it serves, and speaking of self-curation, it serves as a freely available repository of information about your activity. So it's available publicly, internationally, globally, it's out there. It can be updated regularly. So in a way, I think compared to the CV, the online website or the website lends itself more to updates, to modification, to change. So it definitely has more dynamism than your normal CV. And as I mentioned, this is true of the paper CV, but it can evolve as your career evolves. And at least theoretically, the form of the website can evolve as new design elements or as things emerge that people are starting to use. Now, the cons of a professional website would be something like it's still relatively static. So compared, if you're thinking in terms of temporality of self-curation, the online website, well, of course, all websites are online. You see, I'm showing my lack of technical sophistication, but it's still somewhat static. And it's supposed to be. Right? You want your website, the online website, to have a certain solidity to it. You want it to be there so that it has a consistency of information about who you are, your positioning in the field, or your positioning in whatever it is you're representing through the website. You want there to be a certain continuity. You don't want it to be changing too much. So that's something which is in a way both a pro and a con. But more practically, it can be expensive to hire a proper designer. You can spend hundreds of dollars or pounds or whatever the currency is, the equivalent. You can spend thousands Obviously, if you have a research grant or some kind of funding to help with the website, that helps. And I think, again, I could be wrong, but well, if you want to comment about this in the comments to the YouTube video, it seems to me that professional websites are becoming somewhat passé. I'm getting the sense, and I could be wrong, that this is not the go-to platform for self-curation for people coming up, for scholars, for researchers, for academics, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It just means that it's not going to be what people are looking for first when they're looking for information about you. Now, having said that, my website comes up in searches. If it's something which you're taking seriously, it will be something which people will find if they're looking for information about you. Okay, so the second category of platforms that are involving self-curation are the research sharing platforms. Now, these are platforms in which your research in various states, from drafts and prints and lecture notes and different kinds of whatever you want to share, you make available. And the idea is that you're making your work product, broadly understood, freely available to people all around the world. And there are two major ones that I know about: academia.edu, which I don't have an entry on, and ResearchGate, which I have been working with for a while. Now, before I say something about these research platforms, I just want to acknowledge that these platforms and the use of these platforms are, of course, entangled in wider discussions around proprietary versus open access. In other words, who controls the transmission of knowledge? And what's a little bit interesting about these platforms is that both Academia.edu and ResearchGate are themselves proprietary platforms. They're not nonprofit repositories. A lot of universities have their publicly available repositories where, if you know the term, the green road to open access. If you're supposed to, or you want to make your work open access, but you don't want to use the so-called gold road, or you can't use the gold road, which requires the publisher to make your article or even a book open access on publication, you can put a version of your writing up at a public repository, like a university's repository that is searchable, and that is the green road. So but those are nonprofit. That's a university. Most universities, as far as I know, are nonprofit institutions. Certainly, public universities. But Academia.edu and ResearchGate are proprietary. They're earning money either through advertising or through other means, right? But you, the user, are usually not charged to use the site and to make your work available. You have to follow copyright law. That's another issue. But what I would say is that, and now again, just reflecting on my own experience. So I joined ResearchGate in 2016, around 2016. And what I've seen is that people use ResearchGate very differently. I have the way in which I use ResearchGate. So I use ResearchGate mostly almost exclusively to make my work, to share my work of various kinds. And I made a decision from the very early period to make as much of my research available as possible, and not just research. I have PowerPoint presentations of lectures. I have a whole slew of different kinds of material that's there. And I thought to myself, I give a lecture, I prepare something, and not so much my course lectures, but let's say an invited lecture somewhere, and I'm primarily using PowerPoint. I don't have a written paper, but I make a presentation over an hour following the PowerPoint, which has detailed bullet points. That is a form of knowledge production, which has images and so on. And so even though if you just saw the PowerPoint, you might not exactly know what I was arguing in detail, you could get a good sense of what the presentation was about. So I put my PowerPoints up online. Now, I personally am not worried that someone's going to use it or appropriate it in their classroom. If somebody wants to use my images and so on, or even quote, or I hope, what I'm doing in my PowerPoints, then that's fine with me. That's part of this dissemination of knowledge. So I put almost everything I could find that I'm able to share online. And so, but ResearchGate, you can also use that, and I assume maybe it's true of academia.edu, to ask questions, to network. It's described as an academic social networking site, or an academic networking site. And so you can follow people and follow their research and so on. So I don't use it in that way. But more importantly for me, in terms of self-curation and as a platform, what I would say about ResearchGate, and again, I don't know how much this is true of academia.edu or not, is that you're participating in what I think of as the democratization of knowledge sharing. Because if you look at ResearchGate, there's a function that allows you to see where the institutions and countries are associated with who's accessing, downloading your materials. And what I've noticed over the last 7 or 8 years is that it really is a global circulation of material, of research sharing. And it, without knowing for sure, I imagine that it's also allowing teachers and junior scholars and others in places that don't have the resources, that don't have the ability to go on to Amazon and just order a book, or whose institutions are not able to subscribe to these proprietary journal companies like ProQuest, or whatever the searchable engines are that allow you to access articles. So, and they're using this, again, teachers, students, and others to prepare classes, to write theses and so on. And it's really been, for me, a very heartening development to be able to be part of that knowledge sharing, that democratization of knowledge at a truly global level. And I'm not arguing that this is some kind of, the ResearchGate should be understood as a tool of decolonizing our academic practices. But there's absolutely no doubt that this has become a global part of a global circulation of knowledge that has ethical and maybe political implications. So pros and cons to using ResearchGate in particular, I can't see many disadvantages to being part of the democratization of knowledge, being part of arguably maybe the decolonization of our knowledge practices as academics. I think it's an excellent tool, and I think in this sense it's maybe less about self-curation, but yet it is a platform that's part of this broader category, and that's why I included it. Okay, so now we come to the most difficult platform, at least for me, and that's Twitter, otherwise known as X. And personally, I'm not quite sure how I feel about the Twitter versus X, or even how much really matters that some idiosyncratic billionaire bought X. To me, that doesn't really change so much the platform. But I think the first thing I would say about Twitter or X is that this is a platform that, much more than the first two, the academic website, obviously, and the research sharing platform, this is a platform that has a certain gravity that pulls you away from beyond your, we might say, strictly academic form of self-curation, and pulls you beyond into other more political, more personal forms of self-curation. But nevertheless, what I want to talk about is what we might call academic Twitter, or what is called academic Twitter. And as far as I understand it, what this means is simply the part of Twitter, or the part of X, in which academics are participating. And when I say that, what I mean is that if you look at somebody's entry at Twitter, if you're identifying yourself as professor of da-da-da-da, or sociologist, da-da-da-da, and then of course there's always the personal things, father, brother, activist, again, cook. There are a million different ways in which people, let's say, leaven their personal profile with those kind of things. But if it's also being used to do certain kinds of academic activities or certain kinds of activities of academic self-curation, then that would come with an academic, I would call that academic Twitter. That's called academic, not me, but that's called academic Twitter. And I say that because there's all these other little sub-universes of Twitter. You know, my wife is a poet, and she participates in Twitter X, in poetic Twitter, which is itself a sub-genre of literary Twitter. So in her part of the world, the tweets and the people who follow her and she follows are different poets, and people are tweeting about different poems that have been published and events. And then, of course, the other kinds of tweets which have nothing to do with poetry. They have to do with politics and the different crises at hand and so on. But it's still part of poetic Twitter, because at least part of what's being tweeted about is poetry, or in this case, it would be academic work. And the entry identifies you as a poet, as an anthropologist, as a sociologist. And I say that because I don't know if this is true, but perhaps some people have multiple Twitter accounts. So that there's one which is clearly part of academic, or like there's even, say, anthropology Twitter, and each discipline has its own subspace in Twitter. But then you have an account which is just you personally, and then it has nothing to do. So you make an effort to distinguish between the two. So I'm not sure what percentage of people do that or not. I don't do that. And I think a lot of people use their academic Twitter account in these different kinds of ways. And sort of playing the ethnographer, the anthropologist, it seems to me that there are sort of three main ways in which you can use Twitter as a form of, as a platform of self-curation, or there are three ways in which this is used. There might be others and so on. And as you'll see very quickly, I'm very much not an expert in Twitter. I kind of bumble my way into it, and I continue to bumble to a certain extent. So take all of what I'm going to say with a grain of salt, those of you who are experts. But it seems to me that there's a first kind of way in which academic Twitter is used and can be used. And that is to use it to focus almost entirely on your and other academic activities and interest. So this might be the place where you announce things that you're involved in. You're sitting there, you're so-called live tweeting, you're in a conference panel and you're tweeting about that. I just heard an interesting talk by so-and-so, and so on. So there are events, announcements, and you could be commenting also on other people. You could be retweeting or reposting things that who are people who are part of your circle, their announcements, their events, and so on. So that's, and then there are more political kind of strictly non-academic kinds of tweeting you would do, but I would call still within this first categories. And that would be comments on current events, conflicts, and so on, but comments or interventions that draw on your expertise. Okay, so and you'll see that there's a difference in a second. So for example, right now I'm working on electric vehicles and lithium and the green energy, so-called green energy transition. So I'm working on right now a book on lithium, and I'm reading the newspaper also, not all day, but I'm checking in on what's going on. And so there might be an article on problems with EV regulation in the United States, or the fact that the Chinese EV manufacturer has just surpassed Tesla as the world's largest producer of electric vehicles. And so I might link to that and make a comment or say something, but it's linked very closely to my research, you know. Or regionally, I've worked for many years in Bolivia, and there's always something happening in Bolivia, politically or otherwise, and so I might make a comment about something that's gone on in Bolivia, politically or otherwise. So, but it's limited to, it's clearly linked and limited to my academic expertise, my research. Okay, that's the first one. There's a second way in which people use Twitter, and I'm this is my ethnographic observation, which you might think of as hybrid Twitter, or a hybrid use of Twitter. And this is one in which there's a clear distinction between this first kind, the academic use of Twitter, announcements, events, comments on current events, but linked to the research, and a second clear use of Twitter, which is very much more personal, kind of jokey, you know, or political, but political in a way that doesn't seem to be related at all to your research. So you're intervening as a citizen, as a concerned person about whatever it is, but it's not because you want people to listen to what you're saying because you're an expert on that thing. It's because you just think that you have something to say, or you do have something to say, and you want to be part of a conversation about whatever that is. So, you know, I'm looking through people I know who have this kind of hybrid use of Twitter. So they're announcing a book launch, and they're posting a photograph of the wood-burning fire pizza that they made for their family on Friday night, you know, or something other personal. I mean, again, it depends on your situation. Maybe you have a family, so it's ish things about your family. Here I am, I'm on vacation, lovely day at the beach. And there's also the academic side. So there's a hybrid Twitter. And I'm not going to say, I'm not actually in the end going to make, you know, an argument for one or more of these. But then there's a third kind of Twitter that still comes within academic Twitter, in the sense that the accounts that people who are engaged in this third kind are academics. They position themselves as academics. I'm professor of Granada, or I'm a student, or I'm a researcher, or whatever, wherever you are. But I would call this socio-political Twitter. So it's neither the first, the academic activities, and it's really not hybrid because there are very few academic. It's almost entirely a kind of mix between the personal and the socio-political, with a heavy emphasis on the socio-political Twitter. And what this is just like a lot of people who use Twitter, it's tweets and retweets, which are involved in socio-political issues, conflicts, crises. We can imagine, you can imagine different kinds of crises that are happening right now. They might be localized, around your own city, your own neighborhood, your own country, or they might be larger. They might involve a lot of different kinds of things. And these are, this is a kind of use of socio-political Twitter, which obviously has the advantage, I'm going to say, of allowing you to participate in debates as an academic, but not as an academic expert. And there's a difference there. But obviously there are risks, because when you're involved in socio-political Twitter, remember, Twitter is public. Everybody can see Twitter, unless it's, I guess it's a closed or I don't even know if you can close your account, but to the extent to which it's an open account, it's something which is out there in this uncertain public world, global world, in which many millions can potentially read what you're writing, and that might be the point. I mean, that's an advantage. If you're interested in reaching a large number of people, that's one of the best ways to do it. It's obviously you're not going to do that through a personal website or through research sharing. I mean, Twitter is not an academic platform. Academic Twitter is just a sort of metaphor or way of talking about academics, the segment of Twitter in which academics are participating, but it's not some kind of community in which everybody is working together. So just to draw on my own experience, so I avoided Twitter X for most of my career. And I think I did so because going back to my discussion of academic simultaneity, it seemed to me, I didn't know for sure, but it seemed to me that a lot of colleagues I know who were very active on Twitter, I just said to myself, in order to be so active, you have to put a lot of time into that. Because it's not just about sitting there and typing out your 1 or 2 line tweet. You have to be looking at all the other content and tweets that people are doing in real time, and these debates and conflicts that are happening in real time, and then participate in those debates and formulate your response and wait for another response and get involved in that way. So I thought to myself, there's probably a certain charge, adrenaline rush to that, but it's also, there's going to be a cost in terms of your time, your energy, your intellectual energy, and so on. So I didn't join Twitter for most of my career, for over 20 years, until May of 2023. So just less than a year ago. So why did I join Twitter? So just my own personal experience. So what I started to see increasingly is that when announcements were made, thinking about this first use of Twitter, the announcements of books and events and so on, often if I were part of a group, which I often am, there's a group of, let's say a panel. One of the members, usually younger than I am, will send out a tweet. It was so great to have a wonderful discussion about X, Y, and Z with Twitter handle, and Mark Goodale. So I'm just there in text. No hyperlink, no nothing. I'm there. Okay, my presence in that event was acknowledged, but what wasn't happening was the capacity for someone to click on that blue hyperlink and then go learn more about, again, thinking about self-curation, what that person was. So what it did was, in that announcement, my place in that list began and ended with that announcement that the colleague did. Whereas everybody else who's part of academic Twitter, their engagement, the life of that goes on. It maybe something else comes, maybe someone clicks on them, the person who's part of the list, and learns more about them, and then reaches out. And I didn't know. I could only imagine, but I had a fear, this sort of FOMO, the fear of missing out. I feared that in not having a Twitter account, I was somehow missing out on something, this glorious world of interconnectivity and engagement, and I was falling farther and farther behind. So I launched an account. The thing is that I don't think, and this comes back to a person's personality. I never wanted to be part of the full-on socio-political Twitter. The time-consuming, perhaps gut-wrenching political engagement with an unknown world, with unknown consequences, which I saw a lot. That kind of sort of high risk, and high risk in both in the sense of being able to reach out and have your voice heard, but also high risk that something or some things were going to happen that you weren't able to anticipate. So I started with the #1 category. In other words, my Twitter account has covers of the books as my picture. I identify myself as a professor of X, Y, and Z. And I started it when I was back in Lausanne in my home institution. And then when I came to this position at Oxford, I added a little piece, leveraging trust visiting professor, 23, 24, writing about and then I have in the Twitter a link to my professional website. Okay, so kind of unobjectionable. So I started out with an announcement, so nice to do this. And I had to learn, there's a certain language I learned. I think it's the gerund, if I'm not wrong, but as a grammatical form. But there's a certain way in which people talk in academic Twitter or announce things. So please, honored to be, that's actually not a gerund now that I think about it, but honored to be so pleased so happy to say this. So of course I started with that same, I was always so pleased and so honored and like that. So I did that, and that was in May of 2023. However, I made what I like to joke about is the kind of catastrophic choice to try to dabble in hybrid Twitter. So every once in a while, I would drop a personal anecdote, sort of the equivalent of the picture of the wood burning fire pizza on Friday night. And I remember one which I like to think of as infamous, but of course I still don't have a lot of followers, so nobody really cares. But basically, in Switzerland, I was shopping and I came back on a Saturday with our week's groceries, and I was pulling the groceries out, and I saw the package of lettuce, and on the package of lettuce, I noticed for the first time that there was a photograph of the farmer, and he was from the German part of Switzerland, and there was a little, I can't remember what it said, but it had a little tagline like, coming to you fresh from our farm or something like that. And then there was a website, speaking of self-curation, where you could go to the website and learn about that farm where your head of lettuce came from. And there was the person's face who was very happy that you knew who he was, the person responsible for bringing the lettuce. So I took a picture of the lettuce and I tweeted about it. And I'm not a very, I'm definitely not a very humorous person. Apparently, I'm never going to have a second career as a stand-up comic, that's for sure. But I tweeted something like, it turns out in Switzerland, the farmers put their photographs on the packages of lettuce in case you want to put a face to your romaine. And then I can't remember who I tagged. I'm still learning about the art of tagging, what to put there. And I put it out in the world. And it was a complete and utter dud. I mean, okay, I didn't get canceled. It didn't lead to some huge uproar, mostly because nobody's following me and nobody really cares. But it was, I thought, okay, this was gonna soften my profile because I was announcing, so pleased to be blah, 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 so happy to be blah, 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 so honored to be blah, blah, blah. And by the way, look, I buy lettuce and I'm interested in farmers and organic farming. So there, and nobody cared. So I decided to in a way stop dabbling in the personal. But what I have also not done, and that goes back to the original point I made about my own personality, was I have not, and this is now a year on with so much going on in the world, I haven't said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'm going to stop posting images of farmers and I'm going to send post face melting comments about whatever the conflict we might be thinking about, and then get embroiled in all of that. And honestly, I can think of at least one person who joined Twitter, much younger than I am, much better sense of humor, around the same time. And he has a lot more followers. And that's because he made the decision to definitely go hybrid, I would say, and maybe even blending into the socio-political Twitter. Because that's what people want. I mean, that's what, in a way, maybe that's why people are a lot of people are participating in Twitter. But I thought, okay, fine. My own presence, my own as a platform of self-curation might be ultimately limited, but I'm going to use this as a platform which has a much faster temporality than the other platforms I use, but I'm putting on restrictions to the way which I use it so that I feel comfortable doing it. And now it's not to say that every once in a while over the last year, I haven't dropped something that's not related to my academic research. And those tweets, those posts almost always fall. So I don't think I will never have a viral tweet, especially if I'm sticking to so pleased to be blah, blah, blah. So there are some academics for whom that goes viral, but I'm not one of them. So, so what are the risks to using Twitter X? So the risks are too well known to repeat. The temporality can be a real danger with X. Especially if you're using hybrid, and especially if you're using your academic Twitter to engage mostly in socio-political tweets, there can be consequences and repercussions. And that's not to say don't do it. I mean, that might be part of what you're interested in is destabilizing institutions and so on. But obviously there's a practical risk. And in a way, I would say it's another a shadow way in which academics are distinguished by forms of privilege. If you have tenure at a place, you have more privilege than a precarious or more temporary researcher who could be fired or whose contract might not be renewed. So, but leaving that aside, it's important to keep in mind the risk. And I want to use it as an example someone who I know who has made a choice about Twitter, which I think is very interesting. So this is someone who I met back in 2005, so a long time ago. We were both very junior researchers, both assistant professors working on a similar topic. And he joined Twitter in 2008, so a long time ago, I don't know when Twitter was started, but it must be close to the, I think it was close to the beginning of Twitter. He now has 13,000 followers, okay? And he's posted 87,500 times in the last, 16 years? He has, which works out to 5,500 tweets or posts per year, 455 per month, and 15 posts. It works out on average to 15 posts per day, if my math is correct, okay? Now, without giving any information about who this person is or who he is firmly in the third category and has been in the third category from the very beginning. And in fact, interestingly, when I remember back to those days, it was in part his own use of Twitter that I observed, that I came across, that in a sense caused me to not go onto Twitter, that said, well, look, this is what people are using, your colleagues are using Twitter for. It's basically socio-political use. And I followed some of his posts and what comes up below it. And there was a lot of vitriol, and it was crazy. However, if I look back now over this longitudinal period, or this it's almost like a data set, his own experience. He has been involved over the last 16 years in an amazing range of important socio-political issues, several in particular, and he has carved out a place for himself as a leading voice on one of these major issues, which testifies to the 13,000 users, most of whom are not from academia. So he made the choice to use Twitter as, in a way, his primary, not just platform for self-curation, but primary instrument of academic production or intervention. Now, I should say, he managed to go through the promotion process to be promoted to associate professor. He was an assistant professor, as I said, on a tenure track, and be promoted to full professor. So his academic production is still reasonable, but it is clear that most of his intellectual, ethical, and political energy, which gets combined into one thing, has been put toward Twitter, which is not surprising given the numbers that I just quoted. But must also have been teaching, or he's teaching, he has administration and all the other things that an academic who's in that kind of job has to do. And what's interesting is that on his website, or on his Twitter account, he has a pin tweet, which is as you know, the tweet or the post that stays at the top and it doesn't move down as you tweet, which is good, because given how much he tweets, it would be buried in very quickly. And it's a tweet that says, for those of you who like my post, you should also know that I've also written 2 books and published some articles. If you're interested, see my website. And then, speaking of another platform, he has his website down below. That pinned tweet is around 6 years old. So the point is that that he, in a way, recognizes that his identity, his primary positioning as an intellectual, an engaged intellectual, is through Twitter and not through these other things. And I think without making a value judgment about his academic work, which is very solid and very good, it's not at all the primary focus of his activity. But the positive, let's say, or what I think of as the very interesting implication for this particular way of using sociopolitical Twitter as a form of academic self-curation for someone who is privileged enough to be in a position in which you can do that and still keep your job, let's say, is that the argument I would make for this as a potential route, a risky one, and I'm not saying you should take it, I'm just saying this would be the argument, is that what it seems to me that what he's doing is he's radically reimagining how he, as a public intellectual, will ultimately make his mark. I mean, I think that is how you would understand these 87,500 tweets over 16 years. And all of the different things that have come with this. You know, the media has picked up on his tweets. He's appeared on TV and he's interviewed and so on. This is in this area where he is centrally concerned and interested. This is where he's making his mark, which goes well beyond anything that his two books or his articles have done in a way. He's able to shape debates that he's passionate about, both in all three ways, intellectually, ethically, and politically, which go far beyond all of the conventional academic genres, okay? So now again, you can imagine the risks, but I think that there is a radical potential in the socio-political use of Twitter. And I think this case that I'm thinking about shows that. Okay, so I think that's more or less what I wanted to say about academic self-curation. But let me end with the question with which I began, or the title of it, which remains an open one. To self-curate or not to self-curate? That is the question.